Hello, and welcome to Creepy Raindrops. Before you drift off to sleep, let me tell you a story. A story that will help you relax and fall into a deep, peaceful slumber. Sit or lie down comfortably, and let the world around you slowly fade away. Tonight, I will take you on a journey through the woods, where the air is cool and the shadows of the trees stretch long. As you listen, let your mind relax, your body feel heavy, and all the noise in your head gradually fade away. Before we begin, I'd like to know, which city are you listening to this story from? And what time is it there? Close your eyes if you haven't already and let this story guide you into a restful, deep sleep. I live alone in a cottage by the lake, but every night at 3 a.m., the whispering gets louder. The small town of Willow Creek had always been quiet, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. Nestled deep in the woods, right by the glassy surface of Blackwood Lake, was my cottage, a place I'd always dreamed of calling home. My name is Amelia Harper. I'm 32, a writer, and someone who finds solace in isolation. Or at least I used to. I bought this cottage a year ago, enchanted by its rustic charm. The lake shimmered like a mirror in the daytime, reflecting the towering pines and rolling clouds. But at night, the same lake seemed to transform. The water turned black, the wind howled through the trees, and the stillness of the forest pressed down like a heavy blanket. It started small, barely noticeable at first. Faint whispers just beyond the edge of the trees. They would come and go, so faint I almost convinced myself it was nothing. But as the days turned into weeks, they grew louder. Always at the same time, 3 a.m. On the first night I noticed it, I chalked it up to animals in the woods. I even laughed at myself as I locked the door and turned on a few extra lights. But that laughter didn't last. The second night, I woke up drenched in sweat. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. There it was again, whispering. It wasn't random or chaotic. It sounded deliberate, like words spoken just below the threshold of understanding. Amelia, I froze. The sound wasn't coming from the woods this time. It was right outside my window. The whispers grew louder. My breath caught in my throat as I slid out of bed, careful not to make a sound. My heart hammered in my chest as I tiptoed toward the window. Outside, the forest was cloaked in shadow, the lake rippling faintly under the moonlight. Amelia, the voice was clearer now, faint but unmistakable. I dropped to the floor, pressing my back against the wall beside the window. My mind raced. Had someone followed me out here? Was it a prank? Or something worse? The sound moved, circling the cottage. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't walking. There were no footsteps, no crunching leaves, just that eerie whisper, wrapping around the house like a cold breeze. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and quickly dialed the local sheriff's office. Sheriff Tom Lyle, a grizzled man in his 50s with a kind face, had been one of the first people to welcome me to Willow Creek. Sheriff Lyle, I whispered into the phone, my voice trembling. There's someone outside my house. I can hear them whispering my name. His tone shifted immediately. Lock your doors and stay on the line. I'm on my way. I hurried to check the locks, double-checking each one as I clutched the phone to my ear. The whispers were everywhere now, coming from all sides of the house. It was as if the walls themselves were breathing. Amelia, why did you come here? The words made my blood run cold. My hands trembled as I bolted the last door. They're saying my name, I whispered into the phone. How do they know my name? Stay calm, the sheriff said. I'm 10 minutes out. Don't open the door for anyone but me, you hear? Yes, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I retreated to the living room, where the fireplace cast flickering shadows across the walls. My grandfather's old hunting rifle hung above the mantel, a relic I'd brought with me when I moved. I'd never used it, but tonight, it felt like my only protection. I grabbed it down, my fingers fumbling as I checked the chamber. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse. My ears strained, searching for any sound, any movement outside. Then the doorknob rattled. "Amelia, open the door." The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was deep, commanding, and completely unfamiliar. I aimed the rifle at the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. "Go away," I screamed. "The police are on their way." A low chuckle reverberated through the air. "They won't help you." The lights flickered, and the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath fogged in the air as I backed away, gripping the rifle so tightly my knuckles turned white. The doorknob rattled again, harder this time, as if whoever was on the other side was trying to force their way in. And then it stopped. The silence was deafening. I stood frozen, my ears straining for any sound. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness. I sagged with relief as Sheriff Lyle's truck pulled up in front of the house. He stepped out, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. I ran to the door, unlocking it just enough to peek through. "Sheriff," he nodded, his expression grim. "Stay inside." He circled the house, flashlight in hand, scanning the woods and the edge of the lake. When he returned, he shook his head. "No sign of anyone," he said. "But I believe you. You're not the first person to hear strange things out here." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, as if weighing how much to tell me. "This place has a history. The lake, the woods, they're old. Older than this town. There are stories about people hearing voices, seeing things they can't explain. Most folks around here avoid Blackwood Lake at night." I stared at him, my skin prickling with unease. "Why didn't anyone tell me before I bought the place?" He sighed. "It's just stories, Amelia. I didn't think it would bother you." He glanced toward the lake, his expression distant. "But I'd keep your doors locked and your lights on, just in case." He left shortly after, promising to check in on me the next day. But his words did little to ease my nerves. I barely slept that night, the rifle resting on the bed beside me. The following morning, I decided to do some digging. If the lake had a history, I needed to know what I was dealing with. I drove into town and headed straight for the Willow Creek Historical Society. The building was small and dusty, tucked between the post office and a bakery. Inside, an elderly woman named Margaret greeted me with a warm smile. "Looking for something in particular, dear?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. "Blackwood Lake," I said. "Do you have any records or stories about it?" Her smile faltered. "Oh, that place." She sighed, motioning for me to follow her. "We don't get many questions about the lake. Most people around here prefer to forget about it." She led me to a back room filled with old newspapers, maps, and journals. After some searching, she handed me a folder labeled Blackwood Lake, 1873 to 1950. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes. The headlines alone made my stomach churn. "Local man claims to hear voices by Blackwood Lake. Found dead days later. Disappearances continue around Blackwood Lake. Legend of the Whispering Woods. Fact or folklore?" One article stood out. It was about a woman named Eleanor Prescott who had lived in my cottage in the 1940s. According to the article, she had reported hearing whispers outside her home every night for months before she vanished without a trace. Her body was never found, but her diary was recovered. Margaret handed me the diary, her expression somber. "Be careful, dear," she said. That night, I sat by the fire, reading Eleanor's diary. Her entries started out cheerful. filled with descriptions of the lake and the wildlife. But as I read further, her tone changed. The whispers started again last night. They were louder this time, closer. I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I found footprints outside my window this morning. They weren't human. I don't think I'm alone out here. Something is trying to get in. The last entry sent a shiver down my spine. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Don't stay here. Don't listen to them. They want you to. A sudden knock at the door made me jump, the diary slipping from my hands. The clock on the wall read 3 a.m. Amelia, the voice was back. Only this time it wasn't outside. It was inside the house. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears as the voice echoed through the house. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was low and gravelly, like it was scraping against the walls. My breath hitched as I scanned the room, the flickering fire casting dancing shadows that seemed alive. Amelia, the voice came again, louder this time. I grabbed the rifle, my fingers trembling as I backed toward the corner of the room. My mind raced. The diary lay open on the floor where I had dropped it, the warning words glaring up at me. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. They weren't coming from outside. They were coming from the hallway that led to my bedroom. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. Silence. I gripped the rifle tighter, stepping toward the hallway. The wooden floor creaked under my feet, each sound amplifying the suffocating stillness. The hallway was dark. Shadows pooled at the far end where the moonlight didn't reach. I flicked on the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb had blown earlier that week, and I hadn't replaced it. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the fire behind me. Amelia, the voice was right in my ear this time, and I spun around, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. There was no one there. I bolted to the front door, fumbling with the locks, desperate to get out. But as I turned the deadbolt, the handle rattled violently, as if someone on the other side was trying to force their way in. A deep, guttural laugh echoed through the house, sending a chill down my spine. It didn't sound human. I backed away from the door, holding the rifle up, my hands shaking so badly I could barely aim. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and filling the air with an unbearable cacophony. Then the fire went out. I was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon outside. The whispers seemed to press in on me from all sides, growing louder and louder until I wanted to scream. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The whispers stopped. The silence was so sudden and complete that it was almost worse. My ears rang, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the moonlight, something moved. A shadow, tall, impossibly thin, and wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't walk. It glided, its movements smooth and eerie as it stepped closer. I raised the rifle, aiming at the thing. "Stay back," I shouted. It stopped, its head tilting further as if curious. Then it spoke. "Why did you come here, Amelia?" I fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, and for a moment, the muzzle flash lit up the hallway, but the shadow was gone. I stood there, trembling, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the air. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. Then the laughter returned. It was everywhere, echoing through the house, shaking the walls. The front door slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. The laughter grew louder, more menacing, until it felt like the whole house was alive, breathing, mocking me. I dropped the rifle and ran. I didn't stop until I reached Sheriff Lyle's office in town. My clothes were soaked with sweat, my hands shaking as I pounded on the door. The lights inside flickered on, and a moment later, he opened the door, his face filled with concern. "Amelia? What the hell happened?" I told him everything, the whispers, the shadow, the laughter. His expression grew darker with every word. When I finished, he ran a hand through his hair, sighing heavily. "You shouldn't have stayed there," he said finally. "Why?" I demanded. "What's going on? What's wrong with that place?" He hesitated, glancing toward the window as if expecting to see something outside. "There's something you need to know," he said. "Something I didn't tell you before." He motioned for me to sit, and I sank into a chair, my legs barely able to hold me up. "The lake and the woods have always had a reputation," he began. "Long before this town was founded, the native tribes avoided that area. They said it was cursed. They spoke of something in the lake, something ancient and hungry. When the settlers came, they didn't listen. They built cabins, farms, but one by one, they started disappearing." He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. "Over the years, the stories kept coming. People hearing voices, seeing things that weren't there. And then there were the disappearances. No bodies, no traces, just gone." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've seen things myself out there. Shadows that don't belong, voices calling my name. That's why I never go near the lake at night." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "Then why did you let me move out there?" He sighed. "I thought it was just stories. I thought you'd be safe. But now," he trailed off, his gaze distant. "I stayed in town that night, unable to bring myself to go back to the cottage. But even in the safety of the sheriff's office, sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing the whispers in my dreams, kept seeing that shadow at the end of the hallway. The next day, Sheriff Lyle and I drove back to the cottage. He insisted on coming with me, though I could tell he was uneasy about it. The house was eerily quiet when we arrived, the morning sunlight doing little to dispel the lingering sense of dread. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it, except for the diary. It was gone. We searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of it. No sign of anything unusual. But I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. Sheriff Lyle didn't say much as we drove back to town. Before he dropped me off at a motel, he handed me his card. "Call me if anything happens," he said. That night, I lay awake in the motel room, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't stop thinking about the diary, about the shadow, about the voice that had called my name. I didn't go back to the cottage. Not the next day, not the next week. Couldn't. But the whispers followed me. They came at night, faint at first, then louder. No matter where I went, no matter how far I tried to run, I couldn't escape them. And every night, at exactly 3 a.m., I heard it. "Amelia, come back." For weeks, the whispers haunted me. I stayed in the motel, unwilling to return to the cottage. I tried to drown them out with music, white noise, even sleeping pills, but nothing worked. Every night, at exactly 3 a.m., they would begin. Sometimes it was my name drawn out like a chant. Other times it was laughter, soft and mocking, as though the unseen presence was toying with me. It didn't matter where I went. The voices followed me. Sheriff Lyle called every couple of days to check in. I could tell he was trying to help, but his voice carried a weight of guilt. He knew more than he was letting on. I could feel it. Still, he seemed genuinely concerned, and I clung to that as my lifeline. One evening, after yet another sleepless night, I sat in the motel room with a steaming cup of coffee, my laptop open in front of me. I'd been researching the lake, the cottage, and the stories tied to them, but information was scarce. Most of what I found was hearsay, legends passed down through generations. Stories of spirits tied to the land, of people drawn to the lake only to vanish without a trace. The name Eleanor Prescott appeared in several articles, her story eerily similar to mine. A woman who had moved to the cottage seeking peace and solitude, only to be plagued by whispers until she disappeared. One detail, however, caught my attention. Eleanor had been seen walking into the lake the night she vanished, as if in a trance. I couldn't ignore the parallels. If I didn't figure out what was happening, I might share her fate. That night, I decided to call Margaret at the Historical Society. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm but cautious. "Amelia, dear, it's late. Is everything all right?" I hesitated, clutching the phone. "Margaret, I need to know more about the lake, about what's really out there." There was a long pause. "You've read the stories. What more can I tell you? You told me to be careful. You said people around here prefer to forget about the lake. Why? What aren't you telling me?" She sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. "The truth, dear, is that no one knows for certain. But there are theories." "What kind of theories?" My voice trembled, but I pressed on. Margaret hesitated again, then lowered her voice, as though afraid someone might overhear. "Some say the lake is a doorway, a place where the veil between worlds is thinner. They say it calls to people, draws them in, and once it has you, it doesn't let go." The words sent a chill down my spine. A doorway to what? To something old. Something that doesn't belong here. She paused. "That's why I told you to be careful." Margaret's warning stayed with me long after the call ended. A doorway. The idea sounded absurd, but after everything I'd experienced, I couldn't dismiss it outright. I decided to return to the cottage. I didn't want to, but I needed answers. I couldn't live in fear forever, and if I stayed away, the whispers would never stop. Whatever was haunting me, whatever wanted me, was tied to that place. If I was going to break free, I had to face it. The drive back was nerve-wracking. The closer I got to the cottage, the heavier the air seemed to grow. The trees lining the road loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. When I arrived, the house was just as I had left it. The shutters were closed, the windows dark. The oppressive silence pressed down on me as I stepped inside. The atmosphere was different. It felt heavier, as though the house itself had been waiting for me. I left the lights off, relying on the flashlight I had brought with me. I didn't want to disturb whatever was here. I searched the house for any sign of the diary, but it was gone, vanished, as though it had never existed. Frustrated, I decided to check the lake. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the water. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting the trees and stars like a mirror. But as I approached, a faint ripple disturbed the calm. I stopped at the water's edge, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing, just the soft lapping of the water against the shore. Then I heard it. "Amelia." The voice was different now, deeper and more insistent. It came from the lake itself, as though the water were alive. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and swirling around me. I turned, ready to run back to the house, but stopped dead in my tracks. The shadow was there. It stood at the edge of the woods, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. "Why did you come back?" it asked, its voice reverberating through the air. I couldn't speak. My legs felt like lead, my throat dry. The whispers were deafening now, filling my head with words I couldn't understand. The shadow took a step forward. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, like a marionette controlled by unseen hands. "You can't escape," it said. "Not anymore." I stumbled backward, my foot slipping into the water. The cold shock jolted me into action, and I turned to run, but the shadow was faster. It was in front of me now, blocking my path. "Stop fighting," it said. "You belong here." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "No," I whispered. "I don't." The shadow tilted its head, as though considering my words. Then slowly it reached out. Its hand, or what passed for one, was dark and smoke-like, its edges shifting and flickering. "Come with me," it said. I turned and bolted toward the house, my heart pounding. Behind me, the whispers turned to screams, high-pitched and piercing, as though the forest itself was crying out. The air grew colder, the ground beneath my feet seeming to shift and writhe. I barely made it inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. My back pressed against the wood. I listened, waiting for the sound of the shadow following me. But there was nothing, just silence. I sank to the floor, my body shaking. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay here, but I couldn't leave. The lake, the shadow, they wouldn't let me go. Over the next few days, I tried to make sense of everything. The whispers continued, louder now, more insistent. They didn't just call my name. They spoke in fragmented sentences, their meaning just out of reach. I started seeing things too. Shadows that moved when they shouldn't, figures standing at the edge of the lake. At night, I heard footsteps in the house, the floorboards creaking under a weight that wasn't mine. And then, on the 7th night, it happened. I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of whispers, louder than ever. They filled the room, the air vibrating with their intensity. The shadow was there, standing at the foot of my bed. "You can't run," it said. "The lake has chosen you." I stared at the shadow at the foot of my bed, paralyzed by fear. Its edges blurred and shifted, as though it were made of smoke or liquid. Despite its lack of distinct features, I could feel its gaze boring into me. I clutched the blanket tightly, as though it could shield me from whatever this thing was. "You can't run," it said again, its voice deep and resonant, carrying a weight that made the walls seem to shudder. I tried to speak, but my throat felt locked, my mouth dry. My mind screamed at me to move, to do something, but my body refused to obey. The whispers surrounded me, growing louder and louder, overlapping until they were a cacophony of sound that threatened to drive me mad. Then the shadow moved closer. Its form stretched unnaturally, the tips of its smoky limbs reaching toward me. I finally found my voice and screamed, scrambling backward until I hit the headboard. My hand fumbled on the nightstand, grabbing for the small flashlight I'd left there. I switched it on, aiming the beam directly at the shadow. The light cut through the darkness, and for a split second, I thought it was working. The shadow recoiled, shrinking back into itself. But then, to my horror, it began to grow larger, as though feeding on the light itself. The flashlight flickered, its beam dimming before it died completely, plunging the room into darkness once more. "You belong to the lake," the shadow hissed, its voice now filling the room, echoing in my ears. "There is no escape." I screamed again and threw the flashlight at it. The metal clattered to the floor, useless. The shadow loomed over me, its form shifting and twisting, and I felt an overwhelming pressure in my chest, as though the very air had been sucked from the room. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the shadow vanished. The whispers stopped, the pressure lifted, and the room was silent once more. I sat there, trembling and gasping for air, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the quiet. The only sound was the faint rustling of the wind outside. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay at the cottage any longer. Whatever was happening here, whatever had claimed the lake and now me, was beyond my understanding. I packed my belongings in a frenzy, throwing clothes and essentials into a bag. But as I zipped it closed and turned to leave, I heard a knock at the door. I froze, my pulse racing. The knock came again, louder this time. I grabbed the rifle, my hands shaking, and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" I called out. "It's Sheriff Lyle," came the familiar voice. Relief flooded me, and I opened the door, lowering the rifle. Lyle stood there, his face lined with concern. He glanced past me into the house, his hand resting on his holstered gun. "I tried calling, but you didn't answer," he said. "Are you all right?" I shook my head, unable to hold back the tears. "No, I'm not. It's getting worse. The whispers, the shadow, it was in my room last night. I can't stay here, Sheriff. I need to leave." Lyle frowned, his expression grim. "Amelia, listen to me. Leaving won't help. Whatever this is, it's tied to you now. It won't let you go." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" He sighed heavily and gestured for me to sit. Reluctantly, I obeyed, sinking into the worn couch. Lyle remained standing, his hand still on his gun, as though ready to draw it at any moment. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. "Something I should have told you from the start." Lyle's voice was low, almost a whisper, as he recounted the history of the lake and the surrounding woods. He spoke of the settlers who had vanished, of the stories passed down through generations about the lake being a gateway to another realm. But there was more, something darker. Every few decades, the lake takes someone, he said. It's like it demands a sacrifice. The people it chooses, they hear the whispers, see the shadows. It draws them in slowly until they can't resist. And then one night they just disappear. I stared at him, my blood running cold. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I didn't want to scare you," he admitted. "I thought maybe, if you didn't know, you'd be safe. But I was wrong. It's already marked you." "Marked me?" I repeated, my voice rising in panic. "What does that mean?" Lyle hesitated, his gaze flickering to the window. "It means the lake has chosen you. And unless we find a way to stop it, it won't stop until it has you." Lyle stayed with me for the rest of the day, helping me secure the house and go over any clues we might have missed. We found nothing. The diary was still gone, and there were no signs of the shadow or any physical disturbances. But the oppressive feeling remained, a constant weight that made it hard to breathe. As night fell, Lyle insisted on staying the night. He set up a chair near the front door, his rifle within reach, and told me to try to get some rest. I doubted I could sleep, but exhaustion eventually overtook me, and I drifted into a restless slumber. I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of whispers. They were louder than ever, filling the room like a storm. I bolted upright, my heart pounding, and saw Lyle standing in the doorway, his face pale. "It's here," he said. Before I could respond, the front door burst open with a deafening crash. The wind howled through the house, carrying with it the sound of laughter, deep, guttural, and inhuman. Lyle raised his rifle, aiming it at the doorway, but there was nothing there, just darkness. Then the shadow appeared. It was larger now, its form nearly filling the room. Its limbs stretched and twisted, reaching for us as the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. Lyle fired, the sound of the gunshot echoing through the house, but the bullet passed through the shadow as though it were made of smoke. "Amelia, run!" Lyle shouted. I hesitated, torn between fleeing and staying to help. But the shadow moved faster than I could react. It surged forward, enveloping Lyle in its inky darkness. His scream was cut short, and then he was gone. I stumbled backward, tears streaming down my face, and fled out the back door. The wind howled around me, the whispers chasing me as I ran toward the lake. I don't know why I went there. Maybe some part of me thought I could confront whatever this was. Maybe I was just too scared to think. When I reached the water's edge, I stopped, gasping for air. The surface of the lake was no longer still. It churned violently, as though something beneath it was waking. The whispers grew louder, the words becoming clearer. "Come to us, Amelia," they said. "It's time." The lake churned violently, the surface glistening under the faint light of the moon. The whispers surrounded me, weaving through the trees, echoing from the water, and even rising from the ground beneath my feet. It was as though the world itself had come alive, and I was at its center. "Come to us, Amelia," the voices urged, now almost melodic, like a siren's song. My body moved forward, one shaky step at a time, as if something unseen was pulling me closer to the water. The edges of the lake shimmered unnaturally, the dark waves glinting with faint, impossible colors. It felt as though the boundary between reality and something else was dissolving. But I didn't want to go. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn back, to run. Yet my legs betrayed me, carrying me forward in a daze. The voices became louder, overlapping, each one distinct yet part of a collective. I heard my name spoken by dozens, no hundreds of voices. Some were soft and pleading, others cold and commanding. As my foot touched the icy edge of the lake, a piercing sound cut through the whispers. It was a scream, raw and filled with agony. I turned, and to my horror, I saw Lyle standing at the tree line. He was alive, but only barely. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, and his body was partially obscured by a swirling, inky darkness that clung to him like tar. "Amelia!" he cried, his voice breaking. "Don't listen to them." The shadow was there, standing behind him. Its form was larger now, towering over Lyle, its tendrils wrapping around his arms and shoulders. It didn't drag him forward. It didn't need to. He was frozen, unable to move as the darkness consumed him inch by inch. "Run!" he screamed again, his voice desperate. "Get out of here. Don't let them take you." I tried to step back, but the lake pulled harder. The water rippled unnaturally, tendrils of liquid rising like fingers and curling around my ankles. They weren't solid, yet they held me firmly in place, their cold seeping into my skin. Panic surged through me as I struggled to break free, but the more I fought, the tighter the grip became. "Lyle," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Help me!" He tried to move, but the shadow held him fast. His face contorted in pain as the dark tendrils coiled around his throat, silencing him. Then, with a sudden, wrenching motion, the shadow pulled him backward into the woods. His eyes met mine for one fleeting moment before the darkness swallowed him whole. I was alone. The lake's grip tightened, and the whispers became deafening. My vision blurred, the world around me spinning as if I were caught in a whirlpool. The trees bent and swayed in an invisible wind, their branches creaking and groaning like ancient bones. Then I heard a new voice, different from the others. It was deep and commanding, cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Amelia," it said, "you were chosen. Embrace your fate." The voice seemed to come from the lake itself, resonating from deep within the water. It wasn't a whisper. It was a roar, low and guttural, vibrating through my chest. The tendrils around my ankles began to pull, dragging me closer to the water's edge. The ground beneath my feet crumbled, the damp soil giving way as I slid toward the churning waves. "No!" I screamed, clawing at the earth. My nails dug into the dirt, tearing against rocks and roots, but it wasn't enough. The water reached for me, its cold tendrils wrapping around my legs, my waist, my arms. My body was halfway submerged now, the icy grip sending shockwaves of pain through me. "Why are you fighting?" the voice boomed. "This is where you belong." "I don't belong to you," I shouted, my voice raw. "I don't belong to this lake." The water hissed, as though in anger, and the tendrils pulled harder. My head dipped below the surface, and for a moment, everything was silent. The world above disappeared, replaced by a suffocating void. The water was darker than it should have been, black and impenetrable, yet alive with movement. Shapes swirled around me, indistinct but menacing, their outlines sharp and unnatural. I struggled to breathe, my lungs burning as I kicked and thrashed against the water's pull. The shapes drew closer, circling me like predators. I thought of Lyle, of his screams, of the shadow that had consumed him. Was this how it would end for me? Was I destined to vanish into this abyss? Another name added to the lake's growing list of victims? But then, through the darkness, I saw a faint light. It was dim at first, barely more than a flicker. But as I focused on it, the light grew brighter, cutting through the murky depths. It seemed to come from below, deep within the lake's heart. Despite my fear, I felt an inexplicable pull toward it. It was warm, inviting, and unlike anything I had encountered since coming to this cursed place. The voices screamed in protest, their once coaxing tones now shrill and furious. "No, don't go toward the light." But I ignored them. Using every ounce of strength I had left, I propelled myself toward the glow. The water resisted me, the tendrils pulling and clawing at my body, but I pressed on. The light grew stronger, enveloping me in its warmth, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. When I reached the source of the light, I saw it. A small, glowing orb, suspended in the water like a star trapped beneath the surface. It pulsed with energy, its light rhythmic and hypnotic, and as I reached out to touch it, a surge of warmth spread through my body. The whispers stopped, the tendrils loosened their grip, and I felt myself rising, pulled upward by an unseen force. The darkness around me faded, replaced by the pale glow of the moon as I broke through the surface of the water. I collapsed on the shore, gasping for air. My body trembled with exhaustion, my lungs burning as I coughed up water. The lake was still now, its surface calm and glass-like, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. I looked down at my hand, expecting to see the glowing orb, but it was gone. Instead, I felt a strange warmth radiating from within me, as though the light had become a part of me. The whispers were gone. The oppressive weight lifted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. I sat there for hours, staring at the lake, waiting for something to happen. But the shadow didn't return, and the voices didn't call my name. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I knew I had survived the night. But I also knew that the lake wasn't finished with me. Not yet. The morning light didn't bring comfort. It spilled over the lake, turning its once inky surface into a shimmering mirror. But instead of feeling relief, I was filled with unease. The events of the night replayed in my mind in fragmented flashes. The shadow consuming Lyle, the water's grip, the glowing orb, and the warmth now thrumming deep within me. I stumbled back into the cottage, my legs weak and my body heavy with exhaustion. Inside, everything was as I had left it. The overturned chairs, the empty fireplace, and the rifle that Lyle had dropped in the commotion. It was as if the horrors of the night hadn't touched this space. But I knew better. I sat down on the couch, my body sinking into the worn cushions. My fingers traced over the raw scrapes on my palms from clawing at the earth. The pain grounded me, reminding me that I was still alive, still here. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake hadn't let me go entirely. The whispers may have stopped, but a faint hum remained in the back of my mind. A low vibration that wasn't quite a sound, but a presence. It was as if the lake had left a mark on me, something intangible but undeniable. I had questions, so many questions, but no answers. What was the glowing orb? Why had the lake chosen me? And why, despite all of it, was I still alive? I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the window, staring out at the lake as darkness fell once more. The surface was calm, reflecting the moonlight like glass, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from beneath. The memory of the shadow, of its voice and its cold, unrelenting presence, was fresh in my mind. I thought of Lyle, his face twisted in terror as the shadow consumed him. His words echoed in my ears. Don't let them take you. The guilt of leaving him behind gnawed at me, but what could I have done? The lake's power was beyond anything I could comprehend, let alone fight. The hum in my mind grew louder as the hours passed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a constant reminder of the connection I couldn't escape. By midnight, it was nearly unbearable, a pressure building in my skull, urging me toward the lake. No, I whispered to myself, gripping the edge of the windowsill. You're not going back out there, but the pull was relentless. By dawn, I couldn't ignore it any longer. My body ached with the effort of resisting, my head pounding as though something inside me was clawing to get out. The hum had grown into a rhythm, pulsing in time with my heartbeat, and I knew there was no escaping it. I grabbed a flashlight and the rifle, slinging it over my shoulder as I stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, the ground damp with dew, but the beauty of the forest was lost on me. I moved like I was in a trance, my feet carrying me toward the lake of their own accord. When I reached the shore, the hum in my mind stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, like the world had been plunged into a vacuum. The lake was impossibly still, its surface reflecting the pale light of the early morning sun. I stood there, waiting, unsure of what would happen next. Then I saw it. The water rippled, and something began to rise from the depths. My breath caught in my throat as the shape took form. A figure, humanoid but not entirely human. Its body was translucent, its edges shimmering with faint, iridescent light. It was both beautiful and terrifying, a vision that defied logic. The figure stepped onto the shore, and as it did, the whispers returned. They were faint, just a murmur, but they filled the air around me, weaving into an eerie melody. The figure's eyes, if they could be called that, locked onto mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of familiarity, as though I had seen it before. Amelia, it said, its voice resonating in my mind rather than my ears. You carry the light. I stepped back, my hands trembling as I gripped the rifle. What are you? What do you want from me? The figure tilted its head, its movements fluid and unnatural. I am a part of the lake as you are now. You were chosen to bear the light, to keep the balance. Balance? I echoed, my voice shaking. What are you talking about? The figure's form flickered, its edges blurring for a moment before solidifying again. The lake is a boundary, a gateway. The light keeps it closed, but the shadow seeks to open it. The orb you took is the last fragment of the light. Without it, the gateway cannot hold. I stared at it, my mind racing. The orb, the warmth inside me, it all made sense now. The lake had chosen me not to destroy me, but to protect something far greater. The realization was both a relief and a burden. What happens if the gateway opens? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The figure's glow dimmed, and its voice grew somber. If the shadow prevails, the barrier will fall, and the darkness beyond will spill into this world. The figure stepped closer, and I resisted the urge to flee. You must protect the light, Amelia, it said. But beware, the shadow will stop at nothing to take it from you. How? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to fight this. You are not alone, the figure said. The light will guide you. Before I could ask what that meant, the figure dissolved, its form melting back into the lake. The whispers faded, and the world fell silent once more. I stood there, staring at the water, my mind reeling. I didn't have time to process what had happened. The forest behind me erupted with noise, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and an unnatural growl that sent chills down my spine. I turned, my heart racing, and saw the shadow emerging from the trees. It was larger now, its form more defined. It no longer shifted like smoke, but moved with purpose, its tendrils reaching out toward me. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder and more menacing. Give it to us, the shadow hissed. The light does not belong to you. I raised the rifle, my hands trembling. Stay back, the shadow laughed, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the ground. You cannot fight what you do not understand. It surged forward, and I fired. The bullet passed through it harmlessly, but the flash of the muzzle seemed to slow it down. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the earth as I raced back toward the cottage. Inside, I barricaded the door, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The whispers were all around me now, pressing in from every direction. The shadow was outside, its tendrils clawing at the windows, the walls, the very foundation of the house. But then I felt it, the warmth of the light pulsing within me. It was faint at first, but as I focused on it, the warmth grew stronger, spreading through my chest and into my limbs. The whispers faltered, and the shadow let out an enraged growl. I didn't know what I was doing, but I closed my eyes and focused on the light. It burned brighter, filling me with a strength I hadn't known I possessed. When I opened my eyes, the shadow had pulled back, its form shrinking as though it were afraid. This isn't over, it hissed before retreating into the woods. The light within me dimmed, but I knew this was just the beginning. The morning after the encounter with the shadow, the air in the cottage felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were bracing for the next onslaught. I hadn't slept. I couldn't. The shadow's parting words echoed in my mind, a constant reminder that it would return, and it wouldn't stop until it had taken the light from me. I sat at the small table in the kitchen, my hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea. The rifle was within arm's reach, though I knew now how useless it was against the shadow. My mind raced with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. What was the shadow? What was beyond the gateway it was trying to open? And why had the lake chosen me to bear the light? The warmth inside me pulsed faintly, a steady rhythm that was both comforting and unnerving. It felt alive, like a second heartbeat, and I couldn't shake the sense that it was aware of me. It wasn't just a power I carried. It was a presence, something ancient and incomprehensible. I had to learn more. Sitting here, waiting for the shadow to return, wasn't an option. If I was going to survive, if I was going to protect the light, I needed answers. I decided to start with the cabin itself. If the lake had chosen me, there had to be a reason. This place wasn't random. It had history, and I needed to uncover it. The attic was the obvious place to look. I'd avoided it since moving in, partly because it was cramped and dusty, but mostly because I hadn't wanted to confront whatever memories Lyle might have left up there. Now, though, I had no choice. If there was even a chance it held clues about the lake or the shadow, I had to see for myself. The narrow staircase groaned under my weight as I climbed, the sound unsettlingly loud in the silence of the house. When I reached the top, I hesitated. The attic door loomed before me, its wooden surface warped and splintered with age. For a moment, I thought I heard a faint whisper coming from the other side, but when I pressed my ear to the door, there was only silence. Pushed it open. The attic was exactly as I'd imagined. Dusty, cluttered, and dimly lit by a single window streaked with grime. Old furniture, boxes, and other forgotten relics of the past were scattered haphazardly, their shapes looming like ghosts in the half-light. I pulled the chain on the overhead bulb, and a weak yellow glow filled the room. I started with the boxes, sifting through old photographs, journals, and letters. Most of it was mundane, evidence of a family that had lived here long before I arrived. But then I found something that made my breath catch. It was a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. The name on the front was scrawled in faded ink. Henry Talbot. I didn't recognize the name, but the date written beneath it sent a chill down my spine. 1897. I flipped it open, scanning the entries. Most were ordinary. Accounts of daily life, weather, and the struggles of living in such an isolated place. But as I read further, the tone changed. The writing became frantic, the lines scrawled and uneven. July 12, 1897. There is something in the lake. I saw it tonight, just as the moonlight hit the water. A shadow, darker than the night itself, moving beneath the surface. I thought it was my imagination at first, but now I know better. It's watching me. July 20th, 1897. The whispers have started. At first, they were faint, barely more than a suggestion. But now they're louder, clearer. They call my name. They want me to come to the lake. I've resisted so far, but I don't know how much longer I can hold out. July 25th, 1897. The light appeared tonight. I don't know what it is, but it came to me, rising from the lake like a beacon. Feels alive. Spoke to me, though not in words. Told me I had been chosen. Chosen for what, I don't know. But I feel its warmth inside me now, and the shadow is angry. It won't stop until it takes the light. The entries ended abruptly after that. I sat back, the journal trembling in my hands. Henry Talbot had experienced the same thing I was now. A connection to the light, the whispers, the shadow. But what had happened to him? Had he succeeded in protecting the light, or had the shadow claimed him in the end? I turned to the last page of the journal, hoping for more answers. There, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were 5 words. The light is our shield. As night fell, I prepared for the inevitable. The shadow would return, I was sure of it, and I needed to be ready. But how could I fight something I couldn't touch, couldn't hurt? The rifle was useless, and the light, while powerful, was something I didn't fully understand. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the journal open before me. The words on the final page echoed in my mind. The light is our shield. What did that mean? How could I use it as a shield when I didn't even know how to control it? The warmth inside me pulsed, stronger now, as if responding to my thoughts. I closed my eyes and focused on it, letting it fill my senses. The warmth spread through my body, radiating from my chest and into my arms and legs. Felt alive, as though it were trying to guide me. And then I saw it. In the darkness behind my closed eyelids, a vision appeared. Faint at first, but growing clearer. It was the lake, but not as it was now. The water was bright, glowing with an otherworldly light, and figures moved beneath the surface. They weren't human, but they weren't monstrous either. They were something else, something ancient and powerful. The vision shifted, and I saw the shadow. It was larger than I'd ever seen it, its tendrils reaching across the land like an ink stain spreading over paper. It moved with purpose, heading straight for the lake. I opened my eyes, gasping for breath. The warmth inside me surged, and I felt a newfound sense of clarity. The light wasn't just a shield, it was a weapon. I didn't need to understand it fully to use it. I just needed to trust it. The shadow came just before midnight. I felt its presence before I saw it. The air growing colder and heavier, the whispers rising like a storm. It emerged from the woods, its form darker and more solid than before. "You cannot stop me," it hissed, its voice echoing in my mind. "The light will be mine." I stepped outside, the warmth of the light blazing within me. My fear was still there, but it was tempered by something stronger, a sense of purpose. "You'll have to go through me first," I said, my voice steady. The shadow laughed, a deep, guttural sound that made the ground tremble. "Foolish girl, you don't know what you're dealing with." "Maybe not," I said, "but I know one thing. You're not taking the light." The shadow surged forward, its tendrils reaching for me. I closed my eyes and focused on the warmth, letting it fill me completely. The light erupted from me in a blinding flash, pushing the shadow back. It screamed, its form dissolving at the edges, but it didn't retreat. "You cannot hold me forever," it snarled. "This is only the beginning." As it retreated into the woods, I felt a pang of relief but also dread. The shadow would return, stronger and more determined than before. But so would I. I wasn't just a keeper of the light anymore. I was its protector, and the battle had only just begun. The days that followed felt like they belonged to another life. The light inside me had become something I could no longer ignore, an ever-present warmth that seemed to guide my actions, even when I wasn't consciously aware of it. It was as if the lake had placed a part of itself inside me, a power I couldn't yet comprehend but could feel pulsing beneath my skin. I spent my days wandering the woods around the cottage, trying to make sense of everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. I had no map for this journey. There was no instruction manual for someone chosen by an ancient force to protect the balance of the world. The lake had become my obsession. Each time I stood at its edge, I could feel the pull. It was as though the water was calling me, urging me to understand more, to embrace the role I had unwittingly accepted. The shadows still lurked just beneath the surface, and though I had learned to push them back, I knew that my victory was only temporary. The shadow was persistent, and it wouldn't rest until it had claimed what it wanted. It was a calm morning when I felt it again. The hum, faint at first, but growing steadily louder. I had learned to recognize it by now. The presence of the shadow was never far away, and its intentions were clear. It was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I stood at the edge of the lake, staring into the dark water. The fog had begun to roll in, thick and heavy, wrapping around the trees like a shroud. My breath came in shallow gasps, the anticipation of the confrontation hanging in the air. I had no idea what to expect, only that it would be unlike anything I had faced before. The shadow was growing stronger, its power increasing each time we clashed. And as for me, I could feel the light inside me burning brighter with every passing moment, but I didn't know how long I could hold on to it. The whispers returned that evening, more insistent now. I couldn't ignore them, couldn't pretend they weren't there. They twisted through my thoughts, coiling like smoke around my mind. But this time, they weren't just calling my name. They were urging me toward the heart of the lake. The sensation was different now. The pull was stronger, more forceful, as though the lake itself was trying to communicate with me, to tell me something I couldn't yet understand. I stepped closer to the water, feeling the damp soil beneath my feet. The air was thick with tension, and the whispering grew louder with each step I took. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A figure emerged from the fog, barely visible at first, but slowly becoming clearer. At first, I thought it was another trick of the mind, a hallucination born of fear and isolation. But as the figure drew nearer, I knew it was real. It was a woman, tall and graceful, with long dark hair that hung in loose waves around her shoulders. Her eyes gleamed with an otherworldly light, and she moved with the same fluid grace as the figure I had seen on the night Lyle was taken. But this one was different. She seemed familiar somehow, like a distant memory I couldn't place. "Amelia," she said, her voice a soft whisper that seemed to reverberate through the very air. "You are not the first to be chosen. The light you carry has been passed down through generations. It is both a gift and a curse." I froze, my pulse quickening. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite myself. The woman smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "I am the one who was chosen before you," she said. "But I failed. I couldn't protect the light. The shadow consumed me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of history. I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt, of dread, but also a strange sense of recognition, as if I were reliving something I had no memory of. "The shadow is not just an enemy, Amelia," the woman continued. "It is part of this world, as much as the light. Without one, the other cannot exist. The lake is a barrier, a gateway between worlds, and you must choose. Protect the balance or allow the shadow to consume everything." Her words were like a knife to my chest. I wanted to understand, to ask her how I could fight the shadow, how I could protect the light. But before I could speak, she began to fade, her form dissolving into the fog as though she were never truly there. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind reeling with the implications of what I had just learned. What did she mean by protect the balance? How could I do that if I didn't even know what the balance was? I stood at the lake's edge, trying to make sense of everything. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, but this time they felt like a warning. Something was coming, and this time I didn't think I would be able to stop it. Night fell quickly, and with it came the cold. I stood in front of the cottage, the rifle slung over my shoulder, the familiar weight of it offering me little comfort. I had grown used to the hum that pulsed through me, but tonight it was different. The light inside me was dimming, flickering like a candle on the edge of going out. I wasn't sure how long I could keep this up. The shadow had already taken so much from me. Lyle, my peace, my sense of security. It wouldn't stop until it had claimed everything. I walked into the woods, the path barely visible beneath the thick undergrowth, my steps heavy with the knowledge that I couldn't outrun this. The shadow had been toying with me, wearing me down little by little, but it was time to end it. As I reached the clearing near the lake, I saw it again, the figure in the water, the one I had glimpsed before. This time it was clearer, its form more solid. And I knew then that it was no longer just a figure. It was a force, an entity, something ancient and primal that had always existed within the depths of the lake. The light within me flared, pushing back against the darkness that surrounded me. But even as the warmth surged through my chest, I felt the shadow closing in, its tendrils creeping along the edges of my mind. "Amelia," the figure spoke, its voice no longer a whisper but a deep, resonant tone. "You are the last of your line. The light that you carry is the final barrier between this world and the darkness beyond." I gripped the rifle tightly, my fingers white-knuckled against the wood. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice harsh and defiant. The figure's eyes glowed brighter now, and it took a step toward me. "I do not want your light, Amelia. I want you to understand the truth. The light you carry is not your own. It belongs to the lake, and it will always return. The weight of those words pressed down on me, but I stood my ground. I won't let you have it. I won't let you take it. The figure laughed softly, a sound that sent chills through me. You have no choice. The light is already weakening. You cannot fight the darkness forever. And then it lunged, its form shifting and swirling like smoke. I raised the rifle and fired, the shot ringing out through the night, but it passed through the shadow as if it were nothing. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadow didn't retreat. It wasn't afraid. It was only growing stronger. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What could I do? What had I learned? The words from the woman in the fog echoed in my mind. You must protect the balance. The light inside me flickered again, and this time I embraced it fully, letting it fill every part of my being. It was no longer just a warmth. It was a force, a power that had existed since the beginning of time, and I would use it to protect everything I held dear. With a cry, I released it. The light burst forth in a blinding flash, enveloping the shadow, pushing it back with an intensity one had never felt before. The figure screamed, its form twisting and distorting as the light consumed it. But the fight wasn't over. The shadow was still there, waiting, watching. The light burned brighter than ever, a raw, white intensity that seemed to stretch beyond the edges of the lake, flickering like a beacon in the otherwise oppressive darkness. The shadow twisted and recoiled, but it didn't retreat. It merely pulsed and rippled in the air, like liquid smoke, stretching and twisting with an almost malicious intent. I was barely aware of what I was doing, but I knew I couldn't stop. The power inside me surged, overwhelming and uncontrollable, as though it had a mind of its own. It was no longer a gentle warmth or an internal hum. It was a violent torrent of energy that spilled outward, every corner of my being saturated with its force. The air around me seemed to vibrate with it, each pulse reverberating in my chest like the beat of a drum. The shadow writhed, its tendrils shifting, seeking purchase in the air as if it were trying to tear through the space itself. For a moment, I saw something else. A fleeting vision, something that threatened to rip through the fabric of my thoughts. The lake was not just a barrier, it was a doorway, and the shadow wasn't just a malevolent force. It was a manifestation of something much older, something that had been waiting for a way in. I staggered back, suddenly overwhelmed by the vision. The lake wasn't just a natural body of water. It was a prison, a place where something ancient and malevolent had been trapped for centuries. The light inside me, the one I had thought was a gift, was the key to keeping it contained. The whispers had been right all along. I wasn't the first to carry the light. I was simply the most recent, the next in a long line of protectors. Each generation, the shadow had come for the light, and each time, the protectors had fought to keep it from breaking free. But as the years passed, the battles became harder, and the shadow grew stronger. I was standing at the brink of a war that had lasted for generations. A war between light and shadow that had no clear victor. The pain in my chest intensified, a burning sensation that spread outwards like wildfire. It felt as though the very air around me had turned to fire, suffocating me with its heat. I gasped, trying to control the surge of energy, but it was too much. The power I was wielding was far beyond what I had ever imagined. I was being consumed by it, and I had no idea how to control it. The shadow had been pushed back, for the moment, but I could feel it waiting, gathering its strength. The battle was far from over, and the consequences of the fight would be far-reaching. I had barely survived the first clash, but I knew that next time, the shadow wouldn't retreat so easily. I turned back to the cottage, my body trembling from the exertion. The air around me seemed to hum with the energy I had released, as though the very ground beneath me had become charged with the remnants of the light. But the exhaustion was overwhelming. I had no idea how long I could continue fighting this battle. I stumbled through the door of the cottage and collapsed onto the floor, my mind reeling with everything I had just experienced. The lake, the shadow, the light. What did it all mean? What was I supposed to do now? I lay there for what felt like hours, the exhaustion pulling me into a restless sleep. But even in sleep, I couldn't escape the weight of my responsibilities. The visions came again, sharper and more vivid than before. The shadow, twisting and coiling, growing stronger with each passing moment. And the lake always watching, always waiting. The next morning, I woke to a stillness that felt unnatural. The cottage was silent, the air thick with tension. It was as though the world had been holding its breath, waiting for something. I couldn't shake the feeling that the calm was temporary, that the shadow was already preparing for its next assault. I needed answers. I couldn't keep fighting blindly, hoping that the light would somehow be enough to hold the shadow back. There had to be more I could do. I grabbed the journal again, the one I had found in the attic, the one written by Henry Talbot. His words had offered little comfort, but they had given me a glimpse into the truth of the situation. The light wasn't just a defense against the shadow. It was a conduit, a connection between the living world and whatever lay beyond, something that had been sealed away for centuries. The lake had been built as a barrier, a prison, and the light was the key to maintaining that barrier. But what happened when the light started to fade? What happened when the barrier weakened and the shadow broke free? I scanned the pages, looking for something, anything that could help me understand what I was dealing with. There had to be a solution. There had to be something more to the story than what I had pieced together. That's when I found it. Hidden in the back of the journal, buried beneath layers of hastily scrawled notes and erratic scribbles. A map. It was crude, drawn by hand with trembling lines, but it was unmistakable. The map showed the layout of the lake and the surrounding area, with a series of markings leading to a small island in the center. There was no explanation, no legend to clarify the meaning of the markings, but one stood out above the rest. It was a symbol, a simple circular shape that seemed to resonate with the same energy that had thrummed inside me ever since I had first encountered the light. I traced the symbol with my finger, a sense of foreboding settling in my stomach. The island, that's where the answers were. The key to everything was there, hidden away from the world. I didn't hesitate. There was no time to waste. The shadow was only growing stronger, and I had to learn what was hidden on the island before it was too late. I packed a small bag, some provisions, a flashlight, and the journal, and set off toward the lake. The fog had rolled in again, thicker this time, wrapping the trees in a heavy shroud of mist. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. It felt as though the world had grown quiet in anticipation, waiting for me to make my move. The boat was where I had left it, tethered to the dock, rocking gently in the still water. I climbed in and pushed off, the oars creaking in the quiet morning air. The fog parted slightly as I rowed, revealing the distant outline of the island in the center of the lake. It seemed so close, yet so far away, as if the very distance between us was a barrier. The water was eerily calm, the surface smooth like glass, reflecting the gray sky above. As I drew closer to the island, I could feel the pull of the energy beneath the surface, a faint hum that resonated in my chest. The island was not just a place, it was a node, a focal point for the power of the lake. Whatever secrets it held, I was about to uncover them. The boat scraped against the rocky shore, and I stepped out, my legs unsteady from the long row. The island was smaller than I had expected, covered in dense trees and overgrown vegetation. There was no path, no clear direction, just an expanse of nature that seemed to swallow everything in its path. I moved cautiously, my senses heightened, as though the very air around me was charged with a strange, otherworldly energy. And then I saw it. At the center of the island stood an altar, a stone structure, weathered by time, with markings etched into its surface. The symbol from the map was carved into the stone, glowing faintly as I approached. I knelt before the altar, my heart pounding in my chest. The power in the air was overwhelming, and for the first time, I understood the true weight of my responsibility. The light wasn't just a defense against the shadow, it was a part of something much larger. The balance between light and shadow was not just about keeping the darkness at bay. It was about understanding the forces at play and knowing when to release the light or when to contain it. I placed my hands on the altar, closing my eyes, and felt the energy surge through me. The power of the lake, the shadow, and the light all intertwined, creating a storm of raw, ancient force. And then, as though answering a call, a voice filled my mind. "You have come," it said, the voice resonating in my very bones. "Now you must choose." The voice that spoke to me was both familiar and foreign, as if it had existed long before my birth and would persist long after I was gone. It was ancient, resonating in the depths of my consciousness, reverberating through my bones and soul. The words it whispered held the weight of eternity, and yet, in that moment, it seemed to ask for something as simple as a choice. "You have come," the voice echoed again, its tone both inviting and menacing. "Now you must choose." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. I could feel the pulse of the lake, the thrum of its energy beneath the surface. The world around me seemed to fade into nothingness, leaving only the altar and the decision that awaited me. It felt as though time itself had stopped. The air was heavy with the promise of something monumental, something that had been waiting for centuries. The choices I would make here, in this moment, would ripple through the very fabric of existence. My mind raced, and for a moment, I wondered if I was ready to carry such a burden. Could I truly comprehend what was at stake? I placed my hands firmly on the altar, the cold stone beneath my palms grounding me in the present moment. I had no choice but to face the truth. There was no going back from here. The voice continued, its words pulling me deeper into the mystery of the lake, the light, and the shadow. The lake holds the balance between worlds. The light is a tether, keeping the forces of darkness at bay. But the shadow grows stronger, and the light is fading. The question is simple. Will you embrace the darkness, or will you sacrifice yourself to preserve the light? I hesitated, feeling the weight of the words like a crushing weight on my chest. The idea of embracing the darkness, of surrendering to the shadow, was unthinkable. But the thought of sacrificing myself, of being the key to maintaining the fragile balance, was just as terrifying. What would I become if I chose the light? Could I even survive such a sacrifice? The voice seemed to sense my uncertainty. "You are not the first to stand where you stand, Amelia. You are not the first to be chosen to bear the light, and you will not be the last. There have been many before you, and they have made their choices. Some embraced the darkness, and some clung to the light. But there is one truth that has never changed." Pause. The air around me grew still, as if the world itself was waiting for the revelation. "Without the balance, the worlds will collapse," the voice continued, "and the shadow will consume everything." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my racing thoughts. The weight of what I was being asked to do pressed heavily on me. The light that had sustained me all this time, that had kept the shadow at bay, was fading, and I was the only one who could do anything about it. "How?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, as though speaking louder might shatter the fragile tension in the air. "The light must be renewed," the voice responded. "It must be fed by the heart of the lake. Only then will the balance be restored. But there is a price. The light cannot be replenished without a sacrifice. And that sacrifice will change you. It will bind you to the lake, to its power, forever." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of me. The idea of being bound to the lake, of being fused with its power, was terrifying. I had already felt the weight of the light inside me. The burning, the pressure, the constant hum of energy. To be tied to it forever, I didn't know if I could bear that. "But if I don't do it," I said, my voice trembling, "the shadow will consume everything. The lake will be nothing more than a gateway, and the worlds will collapse." "Yes," the voice replied, "and all that you know will be lost. The choice is yours, Amelia, the darkness or the light. Choose." I stood there, my mind spinning, my heart pounding in my chest. The decision before me was monumental. The weight of it threatened to crush me, but I knew, deep down, that there was no other choice. The balance had to be preserved. The lake had to remain a barrier between worlds. Without it, the shadow would take over. It would consume everything. But what would I become if I chose to renew the light? Could I live with the consequences of binding myself to the lake, to the power that had already changed me so drastically? I closed my eyes, trying to center myself, to clear my mind. The whispers in my ears grew louder, the pull of the lake stronger. My body ached with the weight of the decision. There was no easy answer. I could feel the darkness creeping at the edges of my consciousness, tempting me, whispering promises of power and release. But I could not give in. "Do it," the voice urged. Without another word, I took a deep breath and raised my hand. The energy from the lake surged, responding to my gesture. I felt it coursing through me, flooding my veins, filling every part of me. My skin prickled with the intensity of it, and for a moment, I felt as though I might burst from the pressure. And then, without warning, the light erupted from within me, pouring out in a blinding wave, sweeping across the island, over the altar, and into the very heart of the lake. The air crackled with energy, the ground beneath me shaking as the lake absorbed the power. I screamed as the light enveloped me, burning away everything I had known, everything I was. My body felt as though it was being torn apart, remade into something else. For a moment, I thought I might lose myself, that I would be consumed by the very power I had unleashed. But then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The light settled, and I opened my eyes to see the lake before me, its waters calm once more. The energy had been restored, the balance renewed. But I was no longer the same. I stumbled back, my legs weak, my mind spinning. The lake was still there, its waters now clear and still, but I felt something different. A connection, a bond that ran deeper than anything I had ever experienced. I was no longer just a protector of the light. I had become part of it. The lake's power was now a part of me, as much a part of me as my own heartbeat. The voice spoke again, this time softer, as if it were fading into the distance. "You have chosen," it said. "You have embraced the light, and the balance is restored. The shadow will recede for now. But remember, Amelia, the light is never permanent. The balance is always shifting. And one day, someone will have to make this choice again." The words echoed in my mind as the fog began to lift from the island. The sun broke through the mist, casting a warm light over the water. I could feel the weight of my decision settling over me, but there was no turning back. I had done what I had to do, what I had been chosen to do. As I made my way back to the boat, I knew that the shadow was not gone. It was simply waiting, patient and relentless. But for now, I had protected the balance, and the lake's power was once again secure. But I also knew that my journey was far from over. The price of the light, the sacrifice I had made, had changed me in ways I couldn't yet understand. And as the boat carried me back across the lake, I couldn't help but wonder what other forces were out there, waiting for the balance to shift once more. The morning after my decision was both a relief and a burden. As I sat in the small wooden boat, drifting silently across the calm lake, I couldn't shake the weight of what I had just done. The light, the sacrifice, the bond that now tied me to the lake. They were all too much for me to fully comprehend in that moment. What did it mean to be one with the lake's power? Was this transformation permanent? And if it was, what would the cost be for me, for everyone around me? The world around me had changed. The fog had lifted from the island, the mist retreating into the trees, leaving behind a pristine silence. The trees on the shore were still shrouded in morning light, their shadows long and soft across the ground. The lake's surface, once restless and dark, now gleamed with the clarity of untouched glass. It was as though the balance had been restored, but it felt like a temporary calm, a fragile peace in the wake of something much deeper. But I couldn't remain on the lake forever, not without answers. I had no choice but to return to the cottage, to the life I had left behind before all of this had begun. The shadows still haunted me, not just in the lake, but in my mind. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were always there, buried beneath my thoughts, murmuring things I could barely understand. I knew that my connection to the lake's power would come at a price, and I wasn't sure I was prepared for what that might be. The boat scraped against the dock with a quiet thud as I tied it off, taking the first step back onto solid ground. The cottage, small and weathered, stood quietly in the distance, its windows dark and still. I couldn't bring myself to enter, to face the life I had once known. What if I couldn't return to it? What if the person who had walked into the forest the night before wasn't the same person who would leave it now? As I walked toward the cottage, my thoughts were clouded by the unfamiliar weight inside me. There was a hum beneath my skin, an awareness of the power that now coursed through me. It wasn't just physical, it was mental, spiritual. My connection to the lake and the light was more than a mere sensation. It was like the very rhythm of my life had changed. My heartbeat, my breath, they all felt different, as though they were in sync with something older, something vast. When I reached the door, I hesitated. I had no idea how to face the reality of this new life I had chosen. There was no manual, no guidebook that could prepare me for what I had become. I turned the door handle slowly, almost afraid of what I might find inside. The cottage was as it had always been. The fireplace still held the ashes of a fire long gone, and the small kitchen remained untouched. There was an eerie stillness in the air, but nothing had changed in the space around me. I sat down at the small wooden table, feeling a strange sense of displacement. Everything felt familiar and foreign at the same time. The light that had once burned in me had dimmed, or at least it had shifted. I could feel its presence, a quiet hum beneath my skin, but it no longer flared with the same intensity. It was as though the lake's power had settled into a calm, steady rhythm, matching my own pulse. But that didn't mean the danger had passed. I couldn't afford to forget what had happened, or what still might happen. I reached for the journal again, hoping for some semblance of understanding. Henry Talbot's notes were all that remained of the past, a past that felt both distant and painfully close. The final entries, those that spoke of the light and the shadow, offered little comfort. He had known the same truth I had learned. The balance between light and dark was fragile, and when it tipped, it was nearly impossible to restore. The weight of the journal felt heavier now, its pages worn and brittle from years of use. I had to finish what I had started. I had to understand everything. There had to be more to the story, more to the curse of the lake and the shadow it kept at bay. I flipped through the pages, scanning the familiar scribbles, until one note caught my eye. It was a passage that had been marked with a large, almost frantic circle, the ink scrawled with urgency. It was an account of an incident, a warning, written in a hurried, frantic hand. Tonight I hear them again, it read. The whispers, the shadows have changed. I fear they are not what they seem. The light is not a gift. It is a trap, and I am its prisoner. I have seen the truth. The lake is not a protector, but a prison. The shadow is not an enemy. It is a keeper. I stared at the words, confusion and dread settling in my chest. Henry had known something I hadn't understood at the time. He had feared the lake, the power it held, just as I had. But now I was beginning to see what he meant. The lake wasn't just a place of protection. It was a prison that held something far more dangerous than the shadow, something that could break free if the balance was ever disrupted. I closed the journal with trembling hands, the weight of its contents sinking in. The light had not just kept the shadow at bay. It had held something else, something far worse, in check. And I had unwittingly become part of that trap. My decision to renew the light had been a necessity, but it had come at a terrible cost. I had bonded myself to the lake, and in doing so, I had opened a door I wasn't sure I could close. The whispers were growing louder again, echoing in the corners of my mind. They were no longer just murmurs. They were voices, distinct and sharp, calling to me. I couldn't understand their words, but I knew they were not meant for me. They were reaching for something else, something deeper, something that had been waiting beneath the surface for centuries. The air around me seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, and I could feel the energy of the lake pulsing in the distance. I stood up abruptly, my heart racing. There was no more time to waste. I had to go back to the island. There was something there, something I needed to find before it was too late. I grabbed my coat and hurried out of the cottage, the door slamming behind me as I made my way to the dock. The boat was waiting for me, just as it had been the night before, but the calm of the lake was gone. The water was restless now, the waves rolling with a violent energy that mirrored the storm inside me. The whispers were louder than ever, and as I pushed the boat out onto the water, I could feel the weight of the lake's power pulling at me. The island loomed ahead, shrouded in mist once again. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the pull of something deep beneath the surface. The light inside me flickered, uncertain, but I held on to it, pushing forward. When I reached the island, I made my way straight to the altar. The stone was cold beneath my fingers, but the symbol had changed. It was no longer just an etched carving. It was glowing faintly, as though it were alive, responding to my presence. I knelt before the altar, my breath catching in my throat. The voices were louder now, their whispers more distinct, though still incomprehensible. But then, as I pressed my hands against the stone, I understood. The shadow wasn't the only force at play here. There was something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting for me to awaken it. The light had been a binding force, a shield against the darkness, but it was also the key to something else, something far darker. The lake had not been a prison for the shadow alone. It had been a prison for the very force that I had now awakened. And now I had no choice but to face it. The whispers grew louder, their voices twisting and warping, until they became a single unified cry. "Free us," the voice said, and I knew with a terrible certainty that I had made a grave mistake. The night had settled in quickly, casting the island in deep shadows as I knelt before the altar. My hands rested against the cold stone, trembling slightly as the whispers grew louder in my mind. The air was thick with tension, an unseen force pushing against me from all sides. The light that had once comforted me now flickered in my chest, struggling to hold its ground against something far older, more powerful than I could have ever anticipated. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath. The air felt oppressive, and the very ground beneath me seemed to hum with a strange energy. My connection to the lake, to the power within it, pulsed like a second heartbeat, strong, constant, but now tinged with fear. Something had changed. The whispers were no longer just a warning. They were a summons, a call to something that had been waiting beneath the surface for eons. "Free us," the voice had said, its tone echoing through my mind. It was a voice that felt both familiar and alien, as if it had spoken to me across the span of time, as if it had been calling to me long before I had ever set foot on this island. The power I had released when I renewed the light had stirred something beneath the lake, something that had been held captive for far longer than I could comprehend. I tried to push the panic from my thoughts, focusing instead on the reality of the situation. The whispers were not just figments of my imagination. They were a force, a presence that had been bound to the lake for centuries, perhaps even longer. But why had they been trapped here? What had they been waiting for? And more importantly, why had they chosen me? As I sat there in the dimming light, trying to make sense of it all, the answer seemed to surface, as though the lake itself had shared a secret with me in the quiet hum of its waters. The power of the lake was not simply a force of light and protection. It was a balance, light and shadow binding and releasing. The light was not a permanent solution, but a temporary fix, a way to keep the shadow contained. But now that balance had been disturbed. The voices in my mind began to shift, the tone of their whispers changing from pleading to something darker, more demanding. I could feel them pulling at me, trying to reach into my thoughts, to take hold of my will. I clenched my fists against the stone, trying to block out their influence, but the force was overwhelming. It was as though the lake itself was alive, its will pushing against me with an almost palpable weight. "Why do you resist?" the voice asked, no longer whispering but speaking with a calm, unsettling authority. "You know what must be done. You know what we need." My heart raced, the light inside me flaring as I struggled to maintain control. I had to stay focused. I had to understand what I was dealing with. The whispers, the presence that had awakened, had been bound for a reason. But what had been locked away beneath the surface all this time? What was it that I had released? "You have freed us," the voice continued, its words sinking into my mind. "Now you must release the rest." I shuddered at the thought. What else had I unleashed? The whispers had started so innocently, so cryptically, but now they were twisting into something far darker, far more dangerous. "You do not understand," the voice said, this time soft, coaxing, almost sympathetic. "The light you renewed is not enough. It was never meant to be enough. It is but a veil, a temporary fix to keep the true power of the lake contained. But the time for the veil is over. The shadow grows stronger, and the light fades. You cannot hold the balance forever." Amelia, my name echoed in the emptiness, carried on the waves of the lake. It was not a sound I recognized, not the voice of the lake or the light. It was something older, something that had existed long before I had ever arrived. It was the voice of the lake's true power, the force that had been hidden beneath its waters for so long. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. The light wasn't the true power of the lake. It was only a defense, a thin shield that had kept the darkness at bay. The lake itself was something much older, something more ancient, and its true nature was far darker than I could have ever imagined. I staggered back from the altar, my thoughts a swirl of confusion and fear. The whispers seemed to follow me, surrounding me, filling every corner of my mind. I had made a mistake. I had set something free that should have remained locked away, and now I was its prisoner. But I couldn't let it take me. I couldn't let the lake consume me as it had consumed others before. I had to fight, even if I didn't fully understand what was happening. I had to hold on to the light, to the small piece of power I still possessed, or everything would be lost. The sky above began to darken, clouds swirling in an unnatural, almost deliberate pattern. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of salt and earth. The lake's surface rippled violently, as though something beneath it was stirring, something vast and powerful, stretching out, reaching for me. I stood at the altar, my hands pressed flat against the stone once more, the energy of the lake surging beneath my fingertips. The light within me flared again, bright and intense, struggling to hold back the darkness that was clawing at my soul. But the darkness was stronger than I had anticipated. I could feel it pulling at me, twisting my thoughts, urging me to give in. "Join us," the voice coaxed, softer now, like a lover's whisper. "It is the only way. We are part of you now. You are part of us." My mind screamed in protest. I would not give in. But the pull was undeniable. It was as if the very essence of the lake was calling to me, wrapping around my spirit, drawing me closer to the edge of something I wasn't sure I could come back from. I gasped, struggling to breathe as the darkness surged within me, pressing against the light I had held so tightly. My body felt like it was being torn in two, the light and shadow battling within me for dominance. I could feel the power of the lake coursing through my veins, each pulse a reminder of the terrible truth. I had awakened something far more dangerous than I had realized. And in that moment, as the darkness threatened to consume me, I understood the true nature of the balance. It wasn't about light versus dark. It wasn't about good versus evil. It was about control, about the will to maintain the fragile boundary between the two forces. I was not the lake's protector. I was its vessel, its instrument. The realization struck me like a lightning bolt. The light within me had never been meant to protect the world from the darkness. It had been meant to bind me to the lake, to keep me anchored here as part of its eternal struggle. And now that I had embraced the light, there was no escaping it. The whispers faded, leaving behind only a terrible silence. I looked out over the lake, the water now eerily still, reflecting the darkening sky above. The balance had tipped. The light had been renewed, but at what cost? The whispers were gone, but I knew, deep in my bones, that they would return. They always did, and when they did, I would be there, bound to the lake, bound to the darkness and the light, forever. As the days wore on, the power of the lake seemed to weigh heavier on my soul. The whispers had not stopped. They had become part of the fabric of my thoughts, always there, just beneath the surface, reminding me of my place in the balance. The light within me flickered, but it never went out entirely. And the darkness, it lurked just behind, never far, always watching, waiting for the next moment of weakness. I spent my days on the island, not daring to leave, knowing that the lake's grip on me was absolute. Every time I thought of the outside world, of returning to a life I could no longer recognize, the weight of the lake's power pulled me back. I wasn't free anymore. I was bound to it, and the more I tried to fight it, the more I understood that there was no escape. The lake had taken me, had molded me into something new, something caught between the light and the dark. The sun no longer seemed to rise with the same warmth. The mornings were cold, the air thick with mist. The island was silent, save for the soft lapping of the water against the shore, the only constant in my existence. I had become a part of this place, an unwilling guardian of its secret, its curse. The lake had no beginning and no end. It was timeless, ancient, and now I was tied to its fate forever. One night, as I sat near the water, watching the moon's reflection ripple across the surface, I saw something, a figure. It was standing at the edge of the trees, a shadow against the darkness. My heart raced as the figure stepped forward, emerging into the faint light of the moon. The whispers in my mind grew louder, frantic, as if urging me to act, to do something. But I was paralyzed, unable to move. The figure was familiar. It was Henry. He stood there, silent, staring at me with an expression that was both sorrowful and knowing. The journal he had left behind, the words that had warned me, had all been for this moment. He had been right all along. The light was a trap, a false hope, and now it was too late. "Amelia," Henry said, his voice a faint echo, barely audible above the wind. "You've done it. You've awakened it." I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with fear. What was left to say? The darkness had been freed, and there was no one left to fight it. The lake had claimed us both, as it would claim anyone who dared to venture too close to its depths. But even in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to surrender entirely. There was still a flicker of resistance within me, a small part that refused to accept the fate the lake had written for me. Perhaps that was the final test, the true cost of the light. I had to decide whether to fight or to let go, to accept the power of the lake or to stand against it and risk everything. The figure of Henry began to fade, his form dissolving into the mist. His voice lingered in the air, a final warning. "You can never leave." And then he was gone. The lake was still, the whispers silent for the moment, but I knew they would return. I would never be free of this place. But as I stood there, gazing out at the water, I realized that maybe freedom wasn't about escaping the lake. Maybe it was about accepting the power it had given me and finding a way to live with it. As the moonlight bathed the lake in an eerie glow, I turned away from the water and walked back to the cottage. My life, whatever was left of it, had become something else. But the story, the curse of the lake, would never end. It would go on for as long as the lake stood. If you found this story intriguing and want to see more mysteries unfold, be sure to subscribe. There are always new tales to tell, and who knows what secrets we'll uncover together. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more chilling stories.